Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. And we're continuing our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. Remember, yesterday we were talking about how the faith of the Roman Catholic Church changed when it was officially declared at the First Vatican Council that the Pope was infallible. What did that do to the relationship of Roman Catholics to the governments of their nation? And what did it do to their oath of allegiance to the governments of the nations in which they live? Now, R.W. Thompson takes efforts to prove that it was not always believed, not always an article of the faith of the Roman Catholic Church that the Pope was infallible. And giving one example of this, he quotes a question and an answer in a published catechism of the Roman Catholic Church, approved by the Church and by Dr. Manning, the great Archbishop of Westminster. So this is what was in the Catholic catechism. Question: are not Catholics bound to believe the Pope in himself to be infallible? Answer: this is a Protestant invention and is no article of the Catholic faith. So there you have it. At least at the time of the printing of this catechism, papal infallibility was thought to have been a Protestant invention, in other words, to calumniate the Church. And they repudiated the notion. The Roman Catholic Church in this catechism repudiated the notion that the Pope was infallible. Now, what does that mean about the First Vatican Council? When the Pope was officially, as a matter of dogma of the Church, that the Pope is infallible. Did the faith of the Roman Catholic Church change? And again, what did that do to the relationship between Roman Catholics and the governments of the nations? Now, he continues on page 628, if you're following along, the top of the page, and confirmatory of the fact that it was not an article of the faith before the enactment of the dogma to that effect, it is well understood that a considerable number of the bishops petitioned the Pope not to submit to the council his infallibility as a dogma of the faith. So there was great opposition by many of the bishops who warned the Pope, don't make this an official dogma of the Church because it's going to cause problems. But nonetheless, the Pope submitted to the Jesuits' requirement that the Pope be declared infallible and to consolidate all the power of the Church into one head. And it says, of these who protested were 5 archbishops and 22 bishops of America. So it was a significant number of bishops and archbishops from America who tried to dissuade the Pope from taking this action. Now, there's a note at this particular point in the book, and I'd like to read a portion of it. It says, while the council was in session, Archbishop Purcell of Cincinnati addressed to Archbishop Dupanloup of Orleans, France, a letter wherein he says, quote, the American prelates have especial reason to hesitate upon the question of pontifical infallibility. Listen to this now. Neither Catholics nor Protestants in our country, United States of America, admit that the popes have the right to depose sovereigns. In other words, they don't want the Pope to have the power to overthrow the government of the United States, to release subjects from their oath of allegiance. American Catholics don't want the Pope to have the power to relieve Catholics of their oath of allegiance to the country and to transfer, when they please, the kingdom of one prince to another. Okay? American Roman Catholics do not believe the Pope ought to have the right to transfer one kingdom of the kingdom of one prince to another. In other words, to change the king, to depose a king and to install a new one. He says, our citizens of Irish nativity, in other words, the Irish Roman Catholic immigrants to this country, who are the majority and chief support of the Catholic Church in the United States, will have much difficulty in admitting that Pope Adrian IV, who was an Englishman, was infallible when he gave Ireland to Henry II, King of England. On the other hand, the bulls of the popes upon this subject are so clear and positive that the defenders of papal infallibility in general believe themselves forced to admit the temporal sovereignty of the Pope over the universe. So, while there was much support in this country for papal infallibility, there was also great opposition. And some of that opposition came from Irish Roman Catholics who were still steamed that the Pope just carte blanche gave Ireland to England. Pope Adrian IV just simply signed over as though it were his ability to do so, to sign over Ireland to England, to Protestant England, without consulting the Irish people. I mean, a nation was simply grafted into the British Empire without any consult of the church or the people of Ireland. The nation was conquered, and there was never a shot fired because the Pope simply signed it over. Excuse me. So there were Irish Roman Catholics in this country that did not believe in the infallibility of the Pope. Certainly they did not hold Pope Adrian IV as infallible for violating their national sovereignty in such a gross way. Now, R.W. Thompson continues, he says, we shall fail to reach correct conclusions upon this subject unless by observing the true distinction between the church as such and the papacy. The former, that is the church, conveys the idea of universality and includes the whole body of membership, the Pope, the cardinals, and all the hierarchy, and the laymen. The latter, that is the Pope, excludes laymen from any participation in the management of church affairs, and if the Pope's infallibility be conceded, places the entire power and authority of the church in his hands without any responsibility either to the church as an organization or to the lay members. In the former sense, the church has held 19 ecumenical councils before that recently held at Rome, and from the opening of that at Nice down to the last, a period of over 1,500 years, it was universally understood, except by the popes themselves who succeeded Gregory VII, that whatever of infallibility it possessed was lodged in the whole body, acting through the episcopate assembled in general council, or through them and the Pope acting conjointly. There's nothing in the early church history contrary to this, but everything to confirm it. All the dogmas of faith express this idea in one or the other of these forms. The 7 first councils were almost entirely composed of Greeks and were assembled by the Eastern emperors, not by the bishops of Rome. The aggregate number of bishops attending them at different times, different sessions, was 1,486, and only 26 of all of these were Romans. Okay? So where's the primacy of Rome? Where is the primacy of the popes? in the fact that of all the aggregate numbers of bishops attending the universal councils, the ecumenical councils of the church through that time, was 1,486 bishops, and only 26 of them were Romans. Now, if there had been primacy in the pontiff, primacy in the potentious pontiff, which you'd certainly think he would be better represented than merely 26 in all of the 1,486. That's the point R.W. Thompson's making. He says, now there were only 3 Roman bishops at the Council of Nice, and only 1 in each of the first councils of Constantinople and Ephesus. Only 3 at the Council of Chalcedon, only 6 at the Second Council of Constantinople, only 5 at the Third Council of Constantinople, and only 7 at the time of Nice. The Greeks never admitted the primacy of the Bishop of Rome over the Patriarch of Constantinople. And for those who are not aware, we're talking about the 2 iron legs as prophesied by Daniel, the eastern and the western sect of this iron Roman beast. And they each had independent heads. The Western Roman Empire was ruled by the Pope of Rome, arrogated to himself the prerogative of ruling the West, and the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church in the East, in Constantinople. And now it says, the most they ever agreed to was to concede to him primacy of honor, but not jurisdiction. This was a point of perpetual controversy and disagreement, which continued up to the final schism. Okay? So the Eastern and Western Roman Catholic churches, as I tongue-in-cheek call it, the Catholic Church, East and West, Constantinople and Rome, were constantly fighting. And it was always Rome trying to usurp its authority over the East, over the patriarchs of the Orthodox Church. And they had many other controversies regarding doctrine and regarding the worship of images and idols, but it centered always around the primacy of the Pope, continually trying to usurp its authority over the Eastern churches. And it finally led to a final schism and a division between the East and the West. The East would simply not acknowledge the supremacy of the Roman Pope. And it says, and therefore it falsified all history to say that any of these early councils established or recognized the infallibility of the Pope of Rome. The pretense has no shadow of foundation. The Council of Nice did not even consider the assent of the Pope as necessary to the infallibility of its action, and therefore did not submit its decree to him for approval. They were communicated to him and the other absent bishops by Constantine, the emperor, quote, by a letter in his own handwriting, unquote. Constantine tells him that he is to receive them as a quote-unquote divine injunction because, quote, whatever is determined in the holy assembly of the bishops is to be regarded as indicative of the divine will, unquote. So here we have at least one example of Constantine giving support to this notion that the council possessed, if infallibility was possessed at all, which I assert it does not, but if there was any assertion of infallibility or supremacy, Constantine regarded it to be held by the councils, not by the popes. Now it says, and Eusebius, in explanation of the universal Christian sentiment of the 4th century, says that the decrees of the council were confirmed and sanctioned by the emperor. So here the primacy is in the emperor, is it not? And it says he does not mention the Bishop of Rome as having anything to do with them, except that, like all the other bishops, he was required to accept them as the infallible action of the council. So where's the primacy now? In the council. And it says, the first council of Constantinople conceded to the Bishop of Rome the place of honor in the council on account of the superiority of Rome over Constantinople. But they did not extend his jurisdiction or concede to him any power not equally possessed by other bishops. It defined the jurisdiction of each bishop with great particularity, confining each one to his own diocese. The Bishop of Alexandria was to govern Egypt only. The bishops of the East were to govern the East, saving the ancient privileges and prerogatives of the churches of Antioch, those of Asia, their own dioceses, those of Thrace and the churches of Thrace, and those of Pontus, the churches of Pontus. In other words, they were not to meddle in other churches' affairs. Okay? So where do we put this supposed supremacy of the Bishop of Rome in this case? His jurisdiction lies specifically and solely in his own jurisdiction, his own diocese. He as far as jurisdiction goes, he has no authority over any other jurisdiction. Now, that was the early belief. Centuries of precedent in this. And it says, each one was expressly forbidden to interfere with the affairs of other dioceses. Each province was to regulate what concerned itself. And when a bishop was accused, the accusation had to be carried to the bishop of his own province. If they could not decide, the case was taken to the synod of the diocese. No appeal to the Bishop of Rome is spoken of. There is not a word on the subject, says the author. He continues, he says, if there had existed any such idea as that he had supreme jurisdiction over all the churches and was infallible, these provisions would have been perfectly idle and useless. So all evidence indicates that the Pope was nothing but a bishop, just like all the other bishops. Now, nothing can be inferred in favor of the Pope's infallibility from the proceedings of the Council of Ephesus, but directly the contrary. The council was called by the Emperor Theodosius without any conference with the Pope Celestine I. The object of it was to deal with the heresy of Nestorius, Bishop of Constantinople. This prelate and some of his priests had insisted that the Virgin Mary ought not to be called the Mother of God, and I happen to agree. And it says, and the heresy having reached the Egyptian churches, Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria, called a council of the bishops of his province to condemn it. After this was done, the church became much agitated, and both Nestorius and Cyril corresponded with the Bishop of Rome on the subject. His opinion was solicited more as an arbitrator than anything else, certainly not as a final judge. He decided against Nestorius, who appealed to a general council, which was called by the emperor. The council affirmed the decision of Celestine I and deposed Nestorius. In this, there was not a single element of infallibility recognized as being possessed by the Pope, nor was his primacy recognized. If he had possessed either, his judgment would have been executed without a general council. But it had no validity until ratified by a council which he did not call and over which he did not preside either in person or by his legates, and which his legates did not attend until after Nestorius had been tried and deposed. This council reaffirmed what the first of Constantinople had done in reference to jurisdiction by confining the bishops to their own provinces. Now, the Council of Chalcedon gives no more support to papal infallibility than any of the three preceding. Eutyches, a priest and an abbot of the monastery of Constantinople, was found guilty of heresy by a provincial council assembled in that city and excommunicated. He appealed to a general council and wrote to Pope Leo I asking him not to decide the question in dispute between him and his diocesan bishop, but to give his judgment about the point of doctrine alleged to be heretical. Nor did he ask Pope Leo to summon the council. This he solicited from the emperor Theodosius. It was done by the emperor, who caused all the bishops, including the pope, to attend. The pope did not know of it until after it was summoned, but sent his legates. It was presided over by Dioscorus of Alexandria by order of the emperor, the chief legate of the pope having the second place, not the first. And it says, its decision corresponded with that of Pope Leo in reference to the heresy of Eutyches, who had denied the two distinct natures, human and divine, in Christ, and its final result was the enactment of 30 canons. By none of these 30 canons is any jurisdiction conferred upon the Pope which had not already been confirmed by the former councils. On the contrary, by one of them, the 28th, there were expressly conferred upon the Church of Constantinople, quote, the same privileges with old Rome, unquote, and jurisdiction given to it over the dioceses of Pontus, Asia, and Thrace, and the churches, quote, out of the bounds of the emperor, unquote, together with, quote, the right to ordain metropolitans in the provinces of these dioceses, unquote. So there, the jurisdictions are laid out, and the Pope has no primacy. Okay? No infallibility, and no primacy over the Eastern churches, over the Patriarch of Constantinople, or over the emperor, as the popes now claim. And it says here, it will be observed, there's no recognition of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome over the other churches. The first church of Constantinople had conferred upon him only, quote, not the first church, the first council of Constantinople had conferred upon him only, quote, the place of honor, unquote, without interfering with the jurisdiction of any of the bishops except to define it. This council leaves that honorary distinction undisturbed, but when it comes to speak of privileges and jurisdiction, places Rome and Constantinople upon a footing of perfect equality, thus absolutely repudiating the idea of the Pope's infallibility or supremacy. So look how far we've come from the early days of the rise of Antichrist in the world, struggling piece by piece, little by little, to gather up what has now become an overblown human God on earth, and dispensing with councils altogether, and seating and unseating kings, waging crusades, changing one kingdom for another, promoting wars, and rumors of wars, and now declaring that every man, woman, and child should worship him. We'll be back right after this. Now, for my part, all I ask is your prayers, your humble prayers. The prayers of a righteous man availeth much. And the information that you get here on Inquisition Update is not appreciated by the vast percentage of the human family. It is hated, despised. It's called anti-Roman Catholic bigotry. It's called hate speech. None of it is true, but that doesn't stop the assertion. And the assertion is spread from mouth to mouth until it results in death threats and persecution, both of myself and my wife. We live one day at a time here at Inquisition Update. Our enemies far outnumber our friends. And we don't relish that, but we're blessed. The Lord said, the world will hate you because it first hated me. Jesus told the truth, and the truth wasn't eagerly accepted by the world, and it isn't today either. It's one thing to know who Christ is. It's very important for us to know who Christ is and how he redeemed us. But it's also equally important for us to know who Antichrist is. Because the vast percentage of the human race does not acknowledge the Pope as the Antichrist and just considers him, in one fashion or another, just another sect of Christianity. It is none of that. It is the Church of Antichrist. And we here at Inquisition Update make that perfectly clear to those who listen regularly and carefully to what is written in the books that we present here. Now, the Papacy and the Civil Power is probably one of the most powerful books in my entire library on this subject. And if you comprehend this book and my commentary on it, you have to concede that this book should be read by every Christian in this country. Anyone who calls himself a Christian needs to read this book. And it's my pleasure and my blessing to be able to share this book with the listeners. And I hope you'll take it upon yourselves to get a copy of this rare book and keep it available for discussion. Share it with friends and family. And consider it. And in light of current events, not just history, but current events. Current events are just history developing at the moment. And you'll see in current events that nothing has changed. And when you begin to comprehend who in fact is in control of our government, then this book will be the answer. This and many other books that we present here on Inquisition Update. Now, the Pope continues to wrestle in this early age, according to this book, the Second Council of Constantinople. It was called by the Emperor Justinian to settle the controversy about the 3 chapters. And I wish I had taken the time before the program to do a little of my own research on what the 3 chapters are, but I can't tell you. But it was a controversy at that time. It was known as the 3 chapters, and it resulted in the calling of a general council of the church. It says the Second Council of Constantinople was called by the Emperor Justinian to settle the controversy about the 3 chapters. It says Pope Vigilius exhibited some inconsistencies during his proceedings, not being inclined to go to the whole extent of the condemnation demanded by the emperor, but he finally yielded his assent to what was done. It included, however, nothing concerning his jurisdiction, for although he was present at Constantinople during the session of the council, its proceedings were directed almost entirely to the emperor. So where's the primacy? The emperor, right? Now, the Third Council of Constantinople grew out of the controversy about the 2 wills of Christ and was called by the Emperor Constantius Poganatus. okay, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It was another emperor of the Roman Empire, not the Pope, not the bishops. It was the emperor, the secular prince of the Roman Empire, Constantinus Poganatus, such names. You'd just be lucky that you're not me that have to sit before a microphone and read these names. And I'm sure I'm butchering them. I just plead my audience to give some grace here. Okay, Constantinus the harder I try, the worse trouble I get into. Anyway, the emperor called the council with a view to reconciling the disagreement between the Eastern and Western Christians. So here we have the two iron legs again, East and West of Daniel's vision. They're fighting one another, okay? And it says the emperor who was called to settle this disagreement between East and West, the emperor himself presided, although the Pope had 3 legates present. So in other words, the Pope wasn't even there. It was the emperor who called to settle the matter, and the Pope merely sent 3 legates to hear the case. And it says the heresy condemned by the council had been professed over 40 years before by Pope Honorius I, and consequently in finding Sergius, Theodorus, and others guilty of it, they included Pope Honorius by name. In other words, it was settled that this heresy was even observed, whatever it was even observed by the Pope. So where's the infallibility in that, right? Its decrees were approved by Pope Agatho, who has been made a saint by the Roman Catholic Church, so that the proceedings of this council have always been wonderfully perplexing to the advocates of papal infallibility instead of being available to them in support of that doctrine. Okay? So the Jesuits are still scratching their heads after declaring the Pope infallible in 1870 to explain to critics how this so-called infallible Pope was declared a heretic by the emperor and obviously by others, and it even has to be conceded by the Jesuits that papal infallibility is not tenable. Okay? But that doesn't matter. They still insist the papacy is infallible. Now, how Honorius could have been infallible and yet a heretic at the same time is not a little puzzling. Baronius, the analyst, brought all his learning and ingenuity to bear on the question, but as Dupin, the historian, says, quote, his fancy must pass for a matchless piece of rashness, unquote. And it says, while the Jesuits have been taxing their ingenuity to escape the effect of this decree of a general council that Pope Honorius was a heretic and its approval by Pope Agatho, the common sense of mankind has long since settled the difficulty by deciding that neither of these popes was infallible. Manifestly, the Third Council of Constantinople thought so. Constantine Copronymus, the emperor, called a council at Constantinople to settle the dispute about the worship of images. Yes, the Church of Antichrist, early in its formation, couldn't decide whether they should bow down and worship images and idols or not. Forgetting the first commandment and the second commandment, they just were ready to kill one another, and did kill one another, over the dispute of whether or not it was a part of the faith that they should make with their own hands images and idols, those of angels and of Christ and of Mary and the saints and yada, 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 and that they ought to bow down and worship them as a part of the faith. And it was afterward removed, and this council was afterward, in other words, they couldn't settle the matter, okay? So this council was removed And it was taken up again at the Second Council of Nice. And it says the Pope, Adrian I, sent his legates, to whom he entrusted a letter setting forth the necessity and orthodoxy of image worship, which he traced back, of course, to Peter. Isn't it amazing? They can trace this Roman Catholic monster, this idolatrous church in Rome, can trace the worship of images and idols all the way back to Peter. Now that's some hocus pocus, right? It says the letter was addressed to the emperor in the nature of a petition, and among other things entreated the emperor to, quote, cause St. Peter's patrimony to be restored to him and to maintain the Church of Rome's supremacy. Can you believe it? Yes, it was not a decree from the Pope to the emperor. It was a petition. In other words, the Pope, who claims himself to be the vicar of Christ and to be infallible, as it were God on earth, was reduced to beggary in this particular case. He was reduced to beggary. He sent a letter to the emperor. He didn't show up himself. He sent a letter to the emperor in the form of a petition. And among other things, it entreated the emperor, in other words, begged the emperor to return to the Pope his dominions. Why is this infallible Pope on his knees begging the emperor to restore anything to him? It's just one contradiction right after another. And he says he exhibited the accustomed papal presumption in asserting his superiority. But unfortunately, for the cause of papal infallibility, his legates did not venture to lay his insolent demand before the council. Referring to these propositions, Dupin says, quote, the Pope's legates durst not perhaps present them to the synod in which Tarasius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, presided, unquote. In other words, they were not going, the Pope's legates simply were not going to propose papal supremacy in a council that was attended by the Patriarch of Constantinople. They just didn't have the courage to do it. So where's the primacy? Where's the infallibility? It was even questioned by the legates. That's what you can get from this example. It was even questioned by the papal legates who proposed the letter, who brought the letter with them. Now it says the council, this particular council, passed 22 canons, but none of them interfered with the jurisdiction of the churches as previously fixed. So the council simply didn't respond to anything that the Pope wanted. And it says the Fourth Council of Constantinople during the pontificate of Adrian II was called by Basilius, the emperor, again, the emperor calling the council, in consequence of the controversy between Ignatius and Photius after the disposition of the former and the appointment of the latter as Patriarch of Constantinople. So there's even controversy within the Eastern Church, too, over primacy. And it says the Pope took the side of Ignatius, and his decision was affirmed by the council. It says 27 canons were enacted, but one of them, however, having any bearing on the question of the Pope's supremacy. This, the 21st canon, provided, quote, that the Pope of Old Rome ought to be honored and respected in the first place, and next to him the Patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. So the Pope got a gimme. He finally got acknowledged as the first of the bishops. Under what pretense? It doesn't say, but that's what it achieved. And it says it provides that no obloquy should be cast, quote, against St. Peter's holy see and the prince of the apostles, unquote, and that whosoever shall do so shall be condemned for heresy. Also that he shall not be deposed by princes. So here we go, where the Pope's hair is getting bigger, and it says, and when it also provides as follows, and then it also provides as follows, quote, but if a general council being met, there happens any difference with the Bishop of Rome, he ought to be conferred with about the matter, and his answer be had, to make the best of it on either side, and no rash judgment to be passed against the supreme bishop, unquote. The author says, careful observation of this language will show its whole import. In the first place, following the First Council of Constantinople, it assigns the chief place of honor merely to the Pope. Okay? So that's all he gets, just chief place of honor. They got a chair set up for the Pope. And then, in the second place, gives as the reason for it that his precedence of honor was conferred upon Peter when he was made, quote-unquote, Prince of the Apostles. I don't want to take anything from Peter. He gets so beat up during the entire rule and reign of the papacy for nearly 2,000 years. But when was Peter ever assigned to be Prince of the Apostles? I want to see that in my Bible. I mean, I think he presided over the council at Jerusalem, but Peter was assigned equality with the rest of the apostles. There was no war over primacy among the apostles. Certainly, Paul was criticized for having persecuted Christians early on before the Lord called him into service. And it was Paul who tried tactfully to assert his rightful place among the apostles, being questioned by some Jews. But there was no primacy for Peter. And he continues, he says, but all this falls very far short of infallibility, which besides honor includes power and jurisdiction. And the council did not pretend either that Peter had any superior power and jurisdiction beyond that conferred upon the other apostles, or that the Pope had them in any greater degree than the other bishops. So this council determined rightly. There was no primacy in Peter. And if the Pope claims primacy in the name of Peter, then he has no primacy because Peter didn't have any. All right? The Bishop of Rome is just the Bishop of Rome. That's it. Now it says, on the other hand, they in the final clause of the canon exclude any such idea by providing that differences existing between the Pope and others may be settled by the general councils, both parties being heard. So this canon simply says, if the Bishop of Rome, the so-called Pope, has a controversy with any of the other bishops of equal status, they're all bishops, then the general council will settle the dispute after hearing both sides of the argument. Where's the primacy now? It's in the council, right? It doesn't assert that the Pope has any authority or primacy or infallibility. Now, he continues, he says, how could there be any such differences, or how could a council have jurisdiction over them if the Pope was infallible? And this council, it should be observed, met in 869 A.D., long after the temporal power of the popes had begun to grow under the patronage of Pepin and Charlemagne, and just after the pontificate of Nicholas I, who had augmented the power of the papacy by means of the false decretals, the pseudo-Isidorian decretals. All falsehoods, all forgeries, all pretended, universally recognized as such, even by the most authoritative sources of the Roman Catholic Church, admitted them as forgeries. And yet it still forms the basis of this pretension called papal infallibility. Now, even then, the council was unwilling to surrender its supreme jurisdiction over the Pope. Now, after the close of this council, no other general one was held for nearly 250 years. In the meantime, events of the greatest importance bearing upon the increase of the papal power had transpired. By the agency of Pepin and Charlemagne, the popes had severed their allegiance from the emperors. Remember the treason that we talked about earlier in the book, that the Pope of Rome simply usurped his authority over the emperor and declared himself a king over the papal states. And this was due to an unholy alliance between Pepin and later his son Charlemagne. They both committed treason against the emperor, to set up their own jurisdictions. It says, by the agency of Pepin and Charlemagne, the popes had severed their allegiance from the emperors and had become the acknowledged heads of the Western or the Latin Church as distinct and separate from the Eastern or the Greek Church. They had also succeeded in building up an immense fabric of papal power by means of false and forged decretals, which were manufactured as occasion required to suit each exigency as it arose. And being thus separated from the independent of the Greeks, the remaining councils covering the whole period of the Middle Ages was held by the Latin Church and under the immediate auspices of the popes. So this is how the popes got their primacy. They simply did it by treason. It was a unilateral act, as we would use in modern day parlance. He just unilaterally declared himself the king of the West, usurping the authority of the emperor. This is high treason. This will get you shot. But not the Pope. He got by with it. Now, true to the purpose of acquiring every possible degree of power and of establishing their supremacy over the world, they began these Western councils at Rome, where the Pope, by means of Italian influence, could generally have his own way. We shall see, however, that with all these advantages, slow progress was made toward papal infallibility. In other words, getting the Pope declared infallible took at least 1,000 years. That's how much resistance there was throughout history to anything called papal infallibility. And getting this achieved was the principal endeavor of the papacy for 1,000 years. And all of his efforts, in all of its machinations, it took 1,000 years before that council was called in 1870, where the Pope was officially recognized as infallible. He says, we shall see, however, that with all these advantages, slow progress was made toward papal infallibility. It took all the time from 869 A.D. to 1870, 1,000 years, to find a general council with so little self-respect as to place the whole power of the church in the hands of the Pope. Another example of how God has marked the papacy as being nothing more than a beggar, that couldn't even get the assent of his own church without the efforts of 1,000 years of concentrated effort. The Pope is a beggar at best. We'll see you tomorrow on Inquisition Update.